The night was heavy with the scent of autumn, a crisp chill in the air that seemed to embrace the small town of Hollowbrook in an eerie silence. Liam, Claire, Maya, and Tom had gathered at Tom's house, the four of them scattered in a familiar, comfortable mess across the living room. The low hum of an old TV set the tone for the evening as they sipped on warm coffee and shared half-hearted jokes, trying to stave off the weight of a long week. Tom, the perpetual skeptic, was sprawled across the couch, his feet propped up on the coffee table as he flicked through channels with an almost mechanical detachment. He was the type to dismiss every spooky story with a laugh, never giving any credence to local legends or old myths. Tonight, though, he was oddly quiet, staring at the screen without really watching it. "Come on, Liam," Maya said with a sly grin, nudging him from her place on the floor. "Tell us that ghost story from your grandmother's house again. The one about the lady in the mirror." Liam chuckled nervously, leaning back into the armchair, his eyes darting toward the old dusty mirror hanging crookedly above the mantel. He'd always been uneasy about it, especially after his grandmother had told him stories of its history, how it had belonged to an ancestor who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. But he didn't believe in those things. Not really. He glanced at Claire for reassurance. "I don't know. I'm not feeling up to it tonight," Liam murmured, his voice trailing off. Claire, always the curious one, raised an eyebrow. "Why not? You're the one who brought it up." "Because he's afraid," Tom teased, looking over at Liam with a mischievous smirk. "But hey, I get it. Some things are just too creepy, right?" "You're a coward," Maya teased him back, nudging Tom's knee playfully with her foot. A silence fell, but Tom wasn't done. "But you know what? There's something really stupid in this town I've always wanted to try, and none of you have the guts for it." Liam turned to Tom, intrigued. "What's that?" Tom leaned forward, lowering his voice, his words thick with the satisfaction of holding the group's attention. "The game. You know, the one everyone whispers about at 3 a.m. It's just an old myth, really. But supposedly you have to play it exactly at 3 a.m. alone. It's some ancient ritual that's supposed to test your courage." Maya's eyes lit up, and she shot Tom a challenging grin. "You're kidding. A game at 3 a.m.? That's the oldest trick in the book." Tom shrugged nonchalantly, his lips curling into a smug grin. "Hey, if you're so sure it's just a joke, why don't you prove it? I dare you to play it, all of you." Liam snorted. "That's a ridiculous dare. No one's even sure if it's real." "Exactly," Tom replied. "But that's the point, isn't it? No one ever does it. They're too scared." "I think you're just too scared to try it yourself," Maya fired back, her tone sharp with playful mockery. The challenge was laid down, the group feeling the familiar pull of their adolescent need to prove themselves. Claire, however, felt a shiver run down her spine. She wasn't one to shy away from challenges, but something about Tom's tone, the way he spoke with that unnerving certainty, sent a cold chill through her. Still, the temptation to prove him wrong was too strong to resist. "You really want us to do this?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Tom's grin widened. "I dare you, all of you." Liam hesitated, glancing from Tom to Claire to Maya. There was a nervous edge in the room now, a quiet tension brewing in the air, but his curiosity was stronger than his hesitation. "Fine," he said, standing up. "Let's do it. What's the worst that could happen?" "Let's not be stupid," Maya warned, crossing her arms. "We've all heard the stories. People go missing after trying this crap. It's not worth it." But the words of caution only seemed to deepen the pull, the temptation of the unknown. Claire, already feeling the weight of something she couldn't quite place, made a snap decision. She rose from the couch with a defiant smile. "I'll do it. I'll prove it's just a stupid game." The group stared at her, surprised. Liam opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue. There was something in Claire's eyes, a determination that felt darker than usual. Perhaps it was the late hour, or the eerie mood that hung over them, but in that moment they all agreed the dare would be accepted. Claire vanished into the attic shortly after, the creaky steps echoing through the house. She sifted through old boxes, one by one, until she found an ancient, tattered book, its leather cover cracked and worn, the edges of the pages curling. Her breath caught as she flipped through its brittle pages, reading aloud the chilling instructions that promised no harm, only a test of nerves. The rules were simple. The game must be played alone at precisely 3 a.m. when the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. The tasks? Bizarre, unsettling, each one more disturbing than the last. But they all had one thing in common. No one had ever completed it, and those who tried disappeared. Claire closed the book with a snap. The cold air in the attic seemed to deepen, pressing down on her shoulders. Her heart was racing, but she couldn't bring herself to back out now. With a deep breath, she returned to the group, the game in hand, the rules ready to be followed. "Let's play," Claire whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. Tom grinned in the dim light of the living room. "I knew you had it in you." They had no idea that the game wasn't just a game at all, and by the time they realized it, it would already be too late. The room was cold, the walls thick with the weight of the evening's tension. The clock on the wall ticked away, its sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise quiet house. The hour had come, 3 a.m. The group gathered in the living room, their eyes glued to the old weathered book Claire had found in the attic. The fire had died down to a faint glow, casting strange, twisting shadows across their faces. Liam ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the nerves gnawing at his insides. The warmth of the fire seemed miles away now, replaced by the biting chill creeping up his spine. The gravity of the situation was sinking in. This wasn't just some harmless dare. Claire's fingers trembled as she flipped the pages, her face pale in the dim light. The rules were clear, chillingly simple. Each player had to complete a task. Alone. No help, no exceptions. And the clock ticked away, counting down the moments. "All right," Claire said, her voice steady despite the palpable fear in the room. "We go one by one. I'll read out the task, and then we do it. At 3:03 a.m., it's over. No backing out." Maya swallowed hard, her breath shallow. "Are we really doing this? I mean, this is insane, right?" Tom smirked, his usual bravado slipping back into place. "We'll prove it's nothing, just some stupid stories. It's all in our heads." But even Tom couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. The book in Claire's hands creaked as she opened it to the first page. She hesitated, then began to read aloud, her voice echoing softly in the room. The first task: stand in front of a mirror for 5 minutes. You must not blink, nor move, nor speak. The mirror will reveal what you fear most. The words hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on them, suffocating the room with an unseen tension. The silence was deafening as they all turned to face the old cracked mirror above the fireplace, the very same one that had always made Liam uneasy. His mind began to race. What did the game even mean? What was the purpose? But before he could ask another question, Claire had already stood up. "I'll go first," she said, her voice unshaken despite the fear simmering beneath her calm exterior. The others watched as she slowly walked toward the mirror, her feet dragging across the wooden floor as though they were cemented to the ground. The air felt denser now, charged with something electric, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Liam, his heart pounding in his chest, exchanged a glance with Tom and Maya. "You sure about this, Claire?" Claire didn't answer. Instead, she positioned herself in front of the mirror, her eyes fixed on her reflection. The room was eerily still, save for the sound of Claire's breath, shallow and uneven. 5 minutes, Claire muttered, her voice breaking the silence. She stared at her reflection, her face pale and drawn. Time seemed to slow. The ticking of the clock grew louder with every passing second. Liam felt an unsettling unease rise in his stomach. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, like the walls were closing in, the air growing thick with something unseen. For the first minute, nothing happened. Claire stood motionless, staring at her reflection. But as the second minute ticked by, the stillness of the moment began to feel more unnatural. It was as if something was watching her from inside the mirror. Suddenly, without warning, Claire's reflection smiled. Her heart skipped a beat. Claire flinched, stepping back, but her reflection didn't. The smile in the mirror grew wider, more distorted, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling hunger. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in fear, as her reflection began to move independently, tilting its head slowly as it grinned wider. "Claire," it whispered, its voice a twisted echo of her own. Her body froze, her hand reaching out involuntarily toward the mirror. Drawn in by the reflection's malevolent gaze, every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape. But she couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the grin staring back at her. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the smile vanished. The reflection went blank, empty. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Claire's breath was ragged as she stumbled back, her chest heaving, her face drenched in sweat. It's not real," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky. "It's just the game." But the others weren't so sure. "Claire, are you okay?" Maya asked, her voice filled with concern as she took a tentative step forward. Claire didn't answer. Her eyes were wide with panic, her pulse hammering in her neck. The reflection hadn't just smiled, it had spoken to her. And for that split second, she could have sworn it wasn't her own voice answering. But there was no time to dwell on what had happened. The clock continued its relentless ticking. Next, Maya reluctantly stepped forward. "All right, my turn. What's the next task?" Claire handed the book to Maya, who held it with trembling hands, the pages crinkling under her grip. She scanned the next task, her eyes darting across the text. "The second task," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, "is to visit the cemetery and touch the gravestone of the lost one. You must stand by the gravestone for 5 minutes, or the game will claim your soul." Maya's hand shook as she closed the book, her pulse quickening. She shot a glance at Claire, who was still visibly shaken. The fear in the room was palpable now, heavy and suffocating. "Let's just get it over with," Maya muttered, though the words felt hollow even to her. Tom's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "If you think that was bad, just wait until it's your turn, Liam." But Liam didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. Instead, his mind was a whirlwind of doubt and dread. This was no joke. The game wasn't just playing with them. It was feeding off their fear, drawing them deeper into its twisted web. The group stood silently for a moment, all of them feeling the weight of the moment, knowing that once the tasks had begun, there was no going back. And as the clock ticked closer to 3:03 a.m., each of them began to realize the truth. They had made a terrible mistake. The night had taken a turn none of them had expected, and yet, in a twisted way, none of them were surprised. After Maya returned from the cemetery, her hands trembling as she touched the old gravestone, the group reconvened in the living room. The air felt colder now, as if something had entered the room, something that hadn't been there before. The fire that had once crackled warmly now flickered weakly in the hearth, its light casting strange, elongated shadows against the walls. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, more deliberate, as though the house itself was reacting to what had just transpired. The clock ticked relentlessly, each second feeling heavier, like a countdown to something far worse. The time was creeping closer to 3:03 a.m., but instead of relief, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over them. Liam glanced nervously at Claire, who was still pale, her eyes distant as if she hadn't fully returned from the terrifying experience with the mirror. Maya had barely spoken a word since her return from the cemetery. Even Tom, usually so full of bravado, seemed unnervingly quiet, his usual smirk nowhere to be seen. "I think we're done here," Tom said quietly, but his voice had lost its usual edge. This isn't just some game." "I thought we were just supposed to finish the tasks," Maya murmured, her voice shaky as she took a seat on the couch. "I didn't expect this." But Claire wasn't listening. She sat there, still holding the book, her gaze fixed on the next page. "We have to finish," she whispered almost to herself. "It says we can't stop. The game won't let us." The group exchanged uneasy glances. There was no denying the truth that had slowly been seeping into their minds. This wasn't some childish dare. They had unleashed something far darker than they could ever have imagined. With a sense of foreboding, Claire read the next task aloud, her voice trembling. Task 3. Each player must confront their past. Face the memories you have buried deep within, for if you do not, the game will claim what it is owed. The words echoed in the room, each syllable sinking into their hearts like lead. They had been expecting something more physical, something tangible. Perhaps another eerie challenge, or a confrontation with an unseen force. But this was different. The game wasn't just challenging their bravery. It was digging into their very souls, unraveling the parts of them they had locked away. "What does that mean?" Maya whispered. I don't understand." But no one had an answer. They all felt it, an almost magnetic pull toward their own hidden histories, as though the game was reaching into the deepest parts of their minds, preparing to expose their darkest, most painful memories. "I'll go first," Liam said, his voice quieter than usual. He stood slowly, his legs stiff, like his body was resisting the pull to move. He didn't want to do it, but something in the air, something in the book, made him feel like he had no choice. If they didn't follow the rules, he was certain the game would take something worse from them. Liam stepped away from the group and sat down in the chair near the fire, the flickering light casting deep shadows across his face. He closed his eyes, willing himself to push through the fear. He had no idea what was about to unfold, but the weight of the game pressing against him felt almost suffocating. As soon as his eyes shut, memories began to flood in. Too many, all at once. Faces, places, voices. But one memory rose to the surface more clearly than the others. It was a moment from his teenage years. A heated argument with his father's voice raised in anger, the sound of slamming doors, and then silence. Liam glanced nervously at Claire, who was still pale, her eyes distant as if she hadn't fully returned from the terrifying experience with the mirror. Maya had barely spoken a word since her return from the cemetery. Even Tom, usually so full of bravado, seemed unnervingly quiet. his usual smirk nowhere to be seen. "I think we're done here," Tom said quietly, but his voice had lost its usual edge. This isn't just some game." "I thought we were just supposed to finish the tasks," Maya murmured, her voice shaky as she took a seat on the couch. "I didn't expect this." But Claire wasn't listening. She sat there, still holding the book, her gaze fixed on the next page. "We have to finish," she whispered, almost to herself. "It says we can't stop. The game won't let us." The group exchanged uneasy glances. There was no denying the truth that had slowly been seeping into their minds. This wasn't some childish dare. They had unleashed something far darker than they could ever have imagined. With a sense of foreboding, Claire read the next task aloud, her voice trembling. Task 3. Each player must confront their past. Face the memories you have buried deep within, for if you do not, the game will claim what it is owed. The words echoed in the room, each syllable sinking into their hearts like lead. They had been expecting something more physical, something tangible, perhaps another eerie challenge, or a confrontation with an unseen force. But this was different. The game wasn't just challenging their bravery, it was digging into their very souls, unraveling the parts of them they had locked away. "What does that mean?" Maya whispered. I don't understand." But no one had an answer. They all felt it, an almost magnetic pull toward their own hidden histories, as though the game was reaching into the deepest parts of their minds, preparing to expose their darkest, most painful memories. "I'll go first," Liam said, his voice quieter than usual. He stood slowly, his legs stiff, like his body was resisting the pull to move. He didn't want to do it, but something in the air, something in the book, made him feel like he had no choice. If they didn't follow the rules, he was certain the game would take something worse from them. Liam stepped away from the group and sat down in the chair near the fire, the flickering light casting deep shadows across his face. He closed his eyes, willing himself to push through the fear. He had no idea what was about to unfold, but the weight of the game pressing against him felt almost suffocating. As soon as his eyes shut, memories began to flood in. Too many, all at once. Faces, places, voices. But one memory rose to the surface more clearly than the others. It was a moment from his teenage years, a heated argument with his father's voice raised in anger, the sound of slamming doors, and then silence. Liam had spent years trying to forget the fight, the cruelty in his father's words, the way he had belittled Liam's dreams. That argument had been the last time they spoke, and in the years that followed, Liam had buried the pain of it deep within him, telling himself it didn't matter. But the game had a different plan. Suddenly, Liam was transported back to that moment. He could see his younger self, shaking with rage, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the sting of his father's words, the anger and frustration that had built up over years of feeling like he was never good enough, the pain of the harsh words, the betrayal, the loneliness that followed. "You'll never amount to anything," his father's voice echoed in Liam's mind, sharp and cutting, each word like a knife. "You'll be a failure just like everyone else in this damn family." The room spun as the memory took over, as if the very air was pushing him to relive it. He could feel his younger self, torn between defending himself and running away. His heart was racing, a suffocating sense of hopelessness choking him. And then just like that, the memory shifted. Liam was no longer a teenager, but an adult, still haunted by the scars of the past, trying to move on. But even now, the wound had never fully healed. The game wasn't just showing him his memories, It was forcing him to relive them, to experience the raw, unfiltered pain he'd pushed aside for years. Liam gasped as the vision faded. The room came back into focus, and he was back in the chair, his hands clenched tightly around the armrests, his knuckles white. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body trembling. He opened his eyes, seeing the worried faces of his friends staring at him. That wasn't just a memory, he whispered, his voice hoarse. It felt real. You were really there, weren't you? Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. Like you were living it again? Liam nodded slowly, still trying to shake off the sensation of his younger self's anger and pain. I don't know how, but it felt like I was right there, in that moment. The room was quiet for a long moment. They all shared a look, the same realization sinking in. This was more than just a game. It was dredging up everything they had tried to bury, forcing them to confront their worst memories, their deepest regrets. I can't do this, Maya said suddenly, her voice trembling. I can't relive my past. But before anyone could say anything, Claire stepped forward, holding the book in her trembling hands. Her eyes were filled with a determination none of them had seen before. I'll go next, she said, her voice stronger now. If we're going to finish this, we all have to face what's coming. As she sat down in front of the group, her face pale but resolute, Liam realized something he had feared from the very start. There was no way to run from this. The game wasn't just going to haunt them with memories. It was going to unravel every piece of them until there was nothing left. And they were already too deep to turn back. The fire crackled again, its warm glow offering a false sense of comfort as the group sat in tense silence, each of them trying to shake off the weight of their personal confrontations. The clock in the corner ticked onward, its rhythm like a reminder of the relentless passage of time. The stillness was broken only by the occasional rustling of the old journal Claire had found earlier. It sat on the coffee table, a forgotten relic from the past, yet now it felt oddly significant. After Liam's ordeal with the memories, the others had insisted that Claire be the next to face her task. Though she had been reluctant at first, she'd gathered enough courage to open the book, knowing that the next step was inevitable. There had been no way to avoid it. Her fingers trembled as she turned the page, revealing a new task for her to perform. The words were blurry in the dim light, but they were clear enough. Her heart skipped a beat as she read them aloud. Task 4. Discover the truth of your bloodline. Find the roots that bind you to this game. Only then will you understand what you face. A chill swept through the room as the group exchanged confused looks. Discover the truth of their bloodline? What did that even mean? They had no answers, no clue as to where this was leading. It was as if the game was pushing them deeper into a hole with no bottom. Bloodline, Tom repeated, his brow furrowed. What do we have to do, exactly? I don't know, Claire replied, her voice wavering as she scanned the page again. But this feels different. It's not just a task anymore. It's like the game is pointing us to something. The group fell into an uneasy silence. They all knew, deep down, that they had been drawn into something far more sinister than any of them could have anticipated. They had thought the tasks would be simple, even if unsettling, but now they were confronting something that threatened not only their lives but their very understanding of who they were. Maya's voice broke through the stillness. Maybe we need to go back to the attic. You said you found the book there, Claire. Maybe there's something else up there we missed, something that can explain what this game really is. Claire's eyes widened, her pulse quickening. The attic, It had felt like such an innocuous place at first. Just a dusty room filled with forgotten things, relics of a bygone era. But now, in the shadow of the game's terror, it felt like the heart of the storm. Whatever secrets had been buried there, Claire knew they would be crucial to their survival. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising within her. "Let's go back to the attic." The group climbed the creaky staircase, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. The air grew colder as they approached the attic door, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end. Claire hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the doorknob, as if she were bracing herself for something even worse than what had already transpired. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The attic was exactly as they'd left it, dim, dusty, and filled with forgotten treasures. The faint smell of old wood and mothballs lingered in the air. The chest where Claire had found the book sat against the far wall, its brass lock gleaming in the low light. It looked harmless enough, but Claire knew now that nothing in this house was truly harmless. "Let's look around," Liam said quietly, his eyes scanning the room. "There has to be something else, some clue we missed." They began to search the attic, each of them rifling through boxes of old clothes, papers, and knickknacks, their movements rushed and frantic. The sense of urgency was palpable. They were not just looking for answers, they were looking for anything that might help them break free from the game's grip. It was Maya who found it first. Buried beneath a stack of old newspapers, she uncovered a small leather-bound journal, much like the one Claire had found earlier. This one, however, looked much older. The cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. But the markings on the cover were unmistakable. This was no ordinary journal. This has to be it," Maya said, holding it up to the others. "It looks like it belongs to someone in Claire's family. Look at this. There's a name on the inside cover." Claire stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she read the inscription aloud. "Eleanor O'Malley, 1853. O'Malley. Claire's heart skipped a beat. That was her grandmother's maiden name. "This journal, it's hers?" Claire asked, her voice shaky with disbelief. "I don't know," Maya said, flipping through the pages, "but it seems like it's about the game, or at least something connected to it. Look at this." She pointed to a passage in the journal, the ink faded but still legible. The words were chilling. "They came to us in the night. The game, it pulls you in, and once it has you, it never lets go. We must perform the ritual as they did before us. We must call on the spirits that dwell within the game, or they will consume us all. The price for freedom is steep." Tom stepped closer, his face pale as he read over Maya's shoulder. "This is insane. You're telling me this has been going on for generations?" Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know. But it's not just some random game. It's part of my family's past, part of our bloodline. We're tied to it in ways we don't understand." The more they read, the more they discovered about the game's dark history. It wasn't just a game. It was a ritual, passed down through generations. A ritual designed to summon something much darker, something ancient and powerful. The O'Malley family had played it before, and each time it exacted a price. Some family members had vanished without a trace, while others had returned, changed. The journal spoke of a cult, an unholy group that had once used the game to summon malevolent entities, their spirits trapped within the game for eternity. But the most horrifying revelation came when they learned that the last time the game had been played, there had been a ritual sacrifice. A member of the O'Malley family was offered to the spirits in exchange for their release. That person had never returned, their soul bound forever to the game. This is what we're dealing with," Claire said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "This isn't just a game. This is a curse that's been passed down through generations, and now it's our turn." The realization hit them like a cold wave. Their family's bloodline was cursed, and they had unwittingly become part of that dark legacy. The game wasn't just a game. It was an ancient force, alive and feeding on the souls of those who played. And as the group continued to uncover the terrifying history hidden within the journal, they began to understand the gravity of the situation. They were no longer just playing for their own lives. They were playing for the souls of their ancestors, and the price of their freedom would be greater than they ever imagined. The room felt suffocating as the clock on the wall continued its relentless ticking. The weary silence that had fallen over them was punctuated only by the sound of their own shallow breathing. The fire had long since burned low, casting dark, flickering shadows across the room, but it offered no comfort, no warmth. The group sat in a tense circle around the open journal, their faces pale and drawn. The weight of their discoveries had begun to settle on their shoulders, each new revelation a jagged shard of terror that pierced deeper with every passing moment. The game wasn't just some mischievous prank. It was a force beyond their comprehension, ancient, malevolent, and determined to claim their souls. Claire, her hands trembling, closed the journal and stared into the dark, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. The truth was now laid bare before them. This wasn't a game they could simply abandon. Their bloodline, their very existence, was intertwined with it. It had been passed down through generations, like a dark inheritance that could never be escaped. "I don't know what to do anymore," Liam muttered, his voice hoarse. "Every step we take only leads to more darkness. I thought we could stop this. I thought we could get out." Maya's eyes were wide, haunted by the memories of her own task, the visions, the ghostly whispers. They hadn't just been tricks of the mind. They were real, tangible, and deeply personal. She had seen things, heard things that she wished she could forget. "We can't just give up," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't let it win." "But what if it already has?" Tom interjected, his words sharp, almost bitter. "The more we try to fight, the worse things get. People are vanishing. Things are changing. We're not even sure what we're up against anymore. It's like we're trapped in a nightmare with no way out." The idea of giving up was unbearable, but Tom's words had a ring of truth to them. They had tried to outsmart the game, to break its rules, and every time they did, the consequences were more severe. The game had a way of bending reality, of turning their deepest fears and regrets into horrifying, tangible experiences. Nothing they did had stopped it. "Maybe the only way out is to destroy it," Liam said, his voice trembling. "We've been playing by its rules, but what if we break them? What if we destroy the game before it destroys us?" The suggestion hung in the air like a heavy fog. Could they destroy the game? Could they undo the curse that had been passed down through generations? Was there even a way to escape once they had been ensnared by it? "Destroy it?" Maya asked, her voice incredulous. "But what if we can't? What if we're already too deep into it? What if there's no going back?" "Then we die trying," Tom said, his eyes blazing with determination. "We're already losing people. Our lives are slipping away bit by bit. I'd rather go down fighting than let this thing take everything from us." The group fell silent, each person grappling with the impossible choice. Before them, destroying the game would mean breaking its rules, risking the wrath of whatever dark forces controlled it. But continuing to play would mean losing themselves, losing their minds, their souls, and perhaps even their very existence. The tension in the room was unbearable, a thick, oppressive presence that seemed to press in from every corner. No matter what they chose, they would face unimaginable consequences. The game was relentless, and it knew no mercy. "We need to understand what we're dealing with first," Claire said, her voice firm, though the fear in her eyes was palpable. "If we're going to destroy it, we need to know how. We need to understand its weaknesses, its origins. If we can find its source, maybe we can stop it." They all nodded in agreement, knowing that they had no other choice. To destroy the game, they would have to outsmart it, understand it in ways they hadn't even begun to scratch the surface of. But as they stood up to begin their search for the answers, something in the air shifted. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and a faint, unsettling hum filled the silence. The sound was almost imperceptible at first, just a soft, vibrating hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room, vibrating the very walls. A feeling of unease settled in their bones, an instinctual warning that something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. Then the clock struck 3 a.m. The final task had arrived. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The game had always followed a predictable pattern. The tasks, the challenges, each one pushing them further into the depths of fear. But now, as the seconds ticked away toward the fateful 3:03 a.m., it felt as though something far darker was about to unfold. The game was alive, and it was in control. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, blowing out the candle at the center of the table. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, warping and twisting as though they had a life of their own. And in the center of it all, the game, the book, began to pulse, as though it were breathing. Claire recoiled, her heart hammering in her chest. She felt it, a presence, a weight that pressed down on her from every side. The game had sensed their intentions, their desire to end it. It was aware of their plan to destroy it, and it was not going to let that happen without a fight. "What the hell is happening?" Liam gasped, his voice cracking with panic. "We have to do something," Maya shouted, her face a mask of fear and confusion. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to finish us off." The room seemed to close in around them, the walls shifting, the floor tilting under their feet. The game had become something far worse than they had ever imagined. It was no longer just a series of tasks and tricks. It was an entity, a force that fed on fear, that thrived on their suffering, and it was determined to drag them into its world. "We can't let it win," Tom cried, his voice breaking through the chaos. "We have to fight back. We can't let it take us." The clock ticked on, the seconds slipping away as they stared down the final task. They had a choice, but no matter what they decided, there would be no turning back. They were at the edge of the abyss, and the only way forward was through the darkness. Would they finish the game and risk their souls, or would they destroy it and risk everything they knew? As the clock inched toward 3:03 a.m., the group knew that whatever decision they made would seal their fate. The air was thick, as if the very room were closing in around them. Claire's heart raced, a pounding drumbeat in her chest that mirrored the ticking of the clock. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last, stretching time to its breaking point. The shadows in the room swirled, dark tendrils creeping closer as the final task loomed. They had been fighting it, resisting the darkness, but now, with the clock ticking inexorably toward its fateful chime, they knew The worst was yet to come. The game was alive. It wasn't just an ancient, malevolent force that thrived on fear. It was sentient, a living, breathing entity that had grown, evolved, and fed off the terror it created. For a moment, everything seemed too still, the world holding its breath as the clock struck 3:03 a.m. And then the world shattered. A high-pitched sound, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison, filled the room. It reverberated in their ears, a deafening wail that threatened to crack their skulls. The book on the table, once an object of horror, now seemed to pulsate, its pages fluttering as though alive. The words within it seemed to change, shift, become unreadable, as if the very fabric of reality was being bent to the will of the game. It was no longer just a game of tasks. It had transcended that. "Get away from it," Tom shouted, his voice barely audible over the shrieks that filled the room. But it was too late. The game had already begun its final play. The room seemed to distort. The walls, the floor, even the air around them warped, as if the world itself was being rewritten by the game's insidious power. The light flickered, and for a moment, the group was plunged into complete darkness. When the lights flickered back on, the room had changed, subtly but unmistakably. The familiar walls, the worn furniture, the sense of safety, they were gone. The room now felt ancient, decayed, as though they had been transported to a different time, a different place altogether. Claire looked around in horror. "Where are we?" The others were just as disoriented. The windows were gone, replaced by a thick, oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch beyond the room. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of something long forgotten. And in the center of it all, the game, the book, still pulsed, its heartbeat slow and methodical, as if it were the very center of their universe. It was then that they understood the terrible truth. The game wasn't just pulling them into its world. It was rewriting reality itself. "We're not just playing," Liam said, his voice trembling. "We've been part of it all along. The game has been feeding on us, on our fear, on our regrets. It's been manipulating us from the very beginning." Claire's eyes widened as the realization hit. "No, it's not just a game. It's a prison for our souls." Maya's face was ashen, her hand pressed to her mouth as the truth sank in. "We've been trapped. The people who disappeared, they didn't just die. They became part of the game. Their souls are stuck here, lost." The final task, the one that had seemed so simple, had never been about completing a challenge. It had been about transforming them, about breaking them down piece by piece. Every fear, every regret, every painful memory had been extracted from them, fed into the game, and now, as they stood on the precipice, they realized the worst part of it all. The game wasn't interested in their souls. It was interested in their existence, their very essence, their memories, and their identities were at risk. They were no longer just players. They were part of the game, woven into its very fabric. "We can't escape," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. "We're already part of it. We've always been part of it." The others turned to her, their faces filled with a mixture of disbelief and horror. But it was true. They could feel it now, the way the world around them felt wrong, unnatural, as though they no longer belonged to it. They had crossed a line, one they couldn't uncross. There was no going back. The game had them, body and soul. "It's feeding on us," Tom said, his voice hoarse with realization. "It's not just taking our souls. It's erasing us. It's rewriting everything, making us part of its endless cycle. Every player who has ever entered this game, they're gone. erased from existence. "Everything," Liam whispered as the full weight of the horror settled upon him. "Everyone gone, as if they never existed at all." The clock, which had once been their anchor, now seemed to mock them. With each tick, their memories, their identities, their very lives seemed to slip further into oblivion. The clock struck 3:03 a.m. again, and with it came a final, bone-chilling truth. They weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for their very existence. And the game was winning. Suddenly, the book on the table seemed to explode with light. The group stumbled backward, hands shielding their eyes, as the intensity of the light grew blinding. The words on the pages were no longer mere text. They were alive, shifting, writhing, as though they were seeking to consume them. Each word was like a venomous sting, each letter a new thread weaving them deeper into the game's dark web. "Get out!" Maya screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the game's heartbeat, the pulse of an entity that was both everywhere and nowhere at once. As the light reached its peak, the world around them seemed to implode. The room dissolved, the very air thickening, becoming suffocating, until there was nothing left but the oppressive blackness. The book, the game, was the center of it all, and as the light faded, so did everything else. The familiar faces of their friends began to blur, their forms shifting, becoming indistinct, as though they had never existed in the first place. It was then that they understood the final cruel truth. The game didn't just trap souls, it erased them from reality. The memories of their existence, the marks they had left on the world, all vanished, consumed by the very entity they had foolishly dared to challenge. And in that moment, as the clock struck its final eternal note, they knew they had lost. They had never been players, they had always been pawns.